Hello, everyone. Welcome to Friday lunchtime. And I should say, right at the top, I apologize for my dog. He shouldn't be here, but he is. I hope he'll calm down. It feels like it's been quite a slog to get here, quite a big week, whatever you've been up to. So I would like to start by inviting everyone at this Friday lunchtime Sensemaker Live with the support of Santander to exhale. Let's just reflect for a moment that things are looking up, possibly. We have someone who looks halfway sensible heading for the White House. We have someone who is unquestionably divisive, and I choose my words more carefully now than I did in today's Sensemaker newsletter, on his way out of Downing Street. And in the background, we seem to have some very optimistic news about a potential coronavirus vaccine. Our subject, as you will have seen if you've looked on the app, is Biden and Brexit. What does Biden mean for Brexit? And I've scribbled in capital letters at the top of my notebook, will he make a difference, i.e. get us a deal? So obviously of the three things I just mentioned, we'll be talking about the sensible looking fellow who's on his way to the White House. I wouldn't be at all surprised if we talk as well a bit about the divisive fellow who's on his way out of Downing Street. And in the background, unquestionably, there is this reason to be cheerful in the form of the vaccine. It's a huge part of the general mood music, it seems to me, not least economically. And I found myself, as you do, reading the op-ed section of the Telegraph yesterday, and I noticed that in particular on the hardline Brexit side, there is a view that a rapid economic revival, thanks to a vaccine, could make any economic cost, even of a disorderly Brexit, look like a drop in the ocean. That is only an opinion, but it's certainly one that's out there. We are joined today, I'm delighted to say, by Georgina Wright from the Institute for Government, where she's an expert on Brexit and in particular, other people's view of Brexit. But I suspect, Georgina, now your expertise covers every aspect of Brexit. And Eric McElroy, who's an expert on jokes and his home country, the US, although you're joining us, you're in the same time zone, but you're originally from Seattle, and you are a professional comedian who, I believe your stock in trade is channeling views about your home country, which of course has been very much on our minds. But of course, for those of you who've been to any sort of thinking before, this is all about everybody else, your chance to get involved. As ever, I always tell people that there are two ways to pitch in, and I become increasingly pessimistic that people will actually use the blue digital hand, but do give it a shot. Again, click on participants, go to the list, and you'll see your digital blue hand, raise hand option at the bottom. And then, of course, there's the chat where my colleague Hella, I'm sorry, that's a mixture of Harika and Ella. And Ella's hosting, right? Yeah, Ella's hosting. And we reserve the right to come and bother you if you say interesting things, but that you're under no obligation to verbalize them. But we will keep a close eye on what is said in the chat. I just want to do a park run thing. I haven't done this before, but if you ever used to do park run before it was wrecked by COVID, they always say, ask if there are any newcomers. So I'm curious to know if you are here for the first time at a Sensemaker Thinking, raise your blue hand if you'd like to. No? Okay. Oh yes, excellent. Welcome, welcome. Very good. Well, you can imagine the round of applause that you get at the start of a park run, if you've ever been a park run person. And now I wanted to ask if there's anybody who reckons they've been to every single one of these. Raise your hand. Excellent. I'm going to find someone who's not from Tortoise. All right. All right. Thanks very much. Right. To business. We have an hour, and please, I welcome your thoughts on Biden, on Brexit, on how the two may influence each other, on the recent departures this week of two leading Brexiteers from the Downing Street operation, and really anything else that's on your mind, including other aspects of the change of management in Washington, whose significance I don't think can be overstated. But let me start by coming to you, Georgina. The Brexit negotiations have been going on much more in the background in recent weeks than in the previous 4 years, but they have been going on nonetheless. And I'm sort of dimly aware that deadlines have been stretched and broken. Can you bring us up to date on where the process is and what chance you think there is of an orderly resolution? And then, forgive me for piling on a third, the question that we're here to discuss, what difference Biden might make.
Thanks, Giles. Easy questions to kick off there, and obviously answers that could last way more than an hour, but I'll try and be succinct. First and foremost, thank you for having me, and it's such a timely conversation, so I'm delighted to hear what others think as well. But to be honest, in Brexit talks, it's not entirely a surprise that we are where we are. I mean, this is an incredibly complicated negotiation, and it was clear that if there was ever going to be a deal, it would require compromise, and compromise on both sides. And of course, at the moment, you have both sides staring at each other in the eyes, thinking, I don't want to go first, because if I go first, I might lose leverage later on. And also both sides thinking, what price am I really willing to pay for this? And so we are, at this crunch point right now. That being said, I think the fact that we're not hearing much is probably a good sign. It means that there has been much more progress than people think. The kind of complicated bit with any EU trade negotiation is usually towards the end. It's not only the compromise, but it's the technicalities. It's how you translate that compromise into legal text, what the technicalities of kind of that trade, and of course the big stumbling blocks and how you resolve those. So in a sense, I'm sort of fairly upbeat about the fact that we're not really hearing how those are going. And of course, the other thing to remember is the Prime Minister had a phone call with the Commission President last Saturday and said, we still want a deal. We encourage negotiators to work as hard as they can. So clearly there is ambition and willingness on both sides to reach a deal. That being said, the enemy is and will continue, I think, to be the main, time has and will continue to be the enemy of this negotiation, because of course, it's not just about reaching a deal, it's about voting on that deal, particularly on the EU side. So the European Parliament wants time to debate the deal at the committee stage, but also at plenary stage. And then, of course, you need to make sure that businesses and governments are ready for whatever new trading relationship is in place on the 1st of January. So there is a lot to do between now and the end of the year. And the Institute for Government, actually, where I work, has just published a paper on sort of assessing business readiness. And, there is a lot to be done. The government has bought itself time where it could, but there is a significant worry that businesses and traders who export to the EU simply won't be ready in time. So that's where we are with the talks. When is a deal? If there is going to be one, when is it likely? Who knows? I think the EU wanted a deal sort of at least by the end of next week, because that's when Barnier is the chief negotiator, is meeting member states and talking to them. Again, I think
is that really the video conference that I've heard about? The 19th?
Yeah, exactly. So yes, exactly. So usually they meet in person, but obviously given COVID, they're doing it virtually. What I hear from people across the EU is that they think that deadline will be missed. So the question is, how long can they continue talking if they are going to allow enough time for voting and readiness? Finally, on Biden, very quickly, I mean, I think there's been a bit of an exaggeration in a lot of British press and among British Brexit commentators about the impact of Biden on Brexit, partly because I think the UK-US special relationship is about so much more than the UK's position in Europe. So there are lots of things that the UK and the US can continue to cooperate on, regardless of what happens on the Brexit outcome. We're thinking about tech regulation, about finance regulation, about reforming the trade system, about democracies, all of those sorts of things. I think where it has and poses a strategic question for the UK government is what role the UK wants to play in Europe after it. Because one of the key strategic assets for Washington in its relationship with the UK was what role the UK used to play in Europe. So it was sort of part of the EU, but also apart from the EU. And so Washington would kind of use London to find out what was going on in Brussels and to make sure that Brussels was aware of what Washington was thinking. Obviously, the UK can no longer play that role because it was no longer a member of the club. So there's a question there about what role it does play in Europe going forward, particularly if Brexit talks break down and that you can imagine an acrimonious fallout and the UK not being able to work with the EU in quite the same way. So I think that's where Biden's victory poses a strategic question for the UK government. It doesn't, in my view, change the fundamental calculation of Brexit in number 10 that much.
But Georgina, while we're on that, does it make a difference if it is the case, as The Economist and presumably others are reporting, that in their phone call, the first phone call with the European head of government, Biden specifically said, I'm not ruling out a deal with the UK, but you've got to do one with Europe first. If he actually said that, given the importance of a deal with the US to the Johnsonian vision of post-Brexit UK, isn't he forced now to make the compromises necessary to get a deal between now and December 31st?
I mean, again, I think, when Biden did intervene on this throughout the election campaign, that was specifically in response to the government when it came out in Parliament and said that it would potentially break international law. And that was, of course, the UK internal market bill, which held some provisions that were in direct contradiction with the withdrawal agreement that the UK signed with the EU. And obviously, Biden, in his campaign, trying to present himself in diametric opposition to Trump as the defender of international law and human rights, came out and said, that any Brexit outcome that threatens peace and stability across the island of Ireland is a no-go. But again, I think it will depend on, from Biden's perspective, on the Brexit outcome. Does the Brexit outcome at the end of the year, does that threaten peace and stability across the island of Ireland? If it does, then yes, certainly a UK-US free trade agreement is unlikely. But then again, if you talk to circles in London and in Washington, they didn't think a trade agreement was likely anytime next year anyway. But the second question is, does that then mean if you have a Brexit outcome that threatens peace and stability across it, does that mean the end of any form of engagement between the UK and the US? No, obviously, because the UK will continue to be a critical ally for the US. But where it might change is what role the UK plays in Europe and how Washington liaises with the UK on any EU matter. Because of course, at that point, if there's an acrimonious fallout, and yes, there is peace and stability that's threatened across the island of Ireland, then there might be a case where Biden thinks, well, on any EU stuff, I'm just going to pick up the phone to Dublin, Paris or Berlin, because I can't, this is something that clearly is against what I've said before.
Georgina, thank you very much. That's really useful to bring us up to speed on what's happening. I see you, Louise Jarvis, in the chat, and we are definitely not going to ignore this question. Does Cummings' resignation have any impact on the talks? I'm interested also to know what people think about whether it reflects, in any sense, the state of the talks. But Georgina's mention of the sort of relative importance of trade and expectations about a deal with the US is a good segue, Tom, for us to go, because my colleague Tom Goulding has prepared a short set of slides to bedazzle us with.
Hi there, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Charles. So just a few slides on a bit of background to help inform the conversation. Here's the relative proportions of trade that make up UK trade. So the EU provides around about half of UK imports, and roughly the same of exports. What the slide doesn't tell you is the kind of the reverse, I guess, of how big or important the UK is to the US and the EU respectively in terms of their trade, which is the UK is the EU's second biggest trading partner for exports, non-EU trading partner, and the third biggest for imports for the EU, the UK. And for the United States, the UK is the state's fifth biggest trading partner for exports and the 11th for imports. So clearly a bigger role for the EU, the UK plays in trade, which obviously makes sense geographically, but not insignificant for the United States either. So as Georgina mentioned, it's probably worth just giving a very brief recap on the situation there in hopefully a way that doesn't bore people and is concise, but gets to the nub of why Northern Ireland and the border is relevant. Obviously, Boris is taking, and also feel free, of course, Georgina, to correct me, or Chris Cook, not least because the civil servant that I got to explain some of the finer points of this to me on the phone mentioned the Institute for Government's explainers as being very, very useful. So obviously, Boris is taking the UK out of the customs union. So there have to be checks at some point, somewhere, whether on the Northern Ireland Irish border or the Irish Sea, for goods coming in to Northern Ireland that may diverge in terms of their tariffs and their standards compared to what happens in the EU, i.e. in Ireland, to check that those goods don't seep through. And obviously the idea is that you can't have that on the Northern Ireland Irish border because that would probably require physical infrastructure and undermine the Good Friday Agreement. And so Boris's solution to this, as we come to the next slide, is the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was agreed last year as part of the withdrawal agreement. And the idea here is that when a good comes into Belfast, it will pay, if it's deemed at risk of getting into the EU, it will pay a tariff that will then get remitted back to the UK if that good ultimately stays in Northern Ireland. But the tariff to the EU is a kind of recognition of that danger. Now, there are obviously questions that are left there of how is that monitored? How is that enforced? Who are those customs officials picking up that tariff? And those questions are currently being resolved in kind of parallel negotiations in a committee chaired by Michael Gove on the UK side, parallel to the trade negotiations. Now, how is Joe Biden relevant to all this? We are getting there slowly. Obviously, those UK-EU negotiations are ongoing for the future trade arrangement from January onwards, when the UK comes out of that customs union, and all of this is relevant. And if there is no deal, then the UK's controversial internal market bill would allow, which is Boris's bill, which is the source of the charge that the UK is going back on its own internationally agreed agreements with the EU. A couple of clauses in that internal market bill, if it passed through Parliament, would allow the UK to disregard its own Northern Ireland Protocol to essentially allow frictionless trade to continue with Northern Ireland in the event of no deal from January going forward. And the idea is that that bill and those clauses would risk instability in the region because the whole arrangement of how goods work and how they're checked and the Northern Ireland Protocol would be undermined and ignored. And so Joe Biden and the Democrats are against that ignoring. And it's also, the lack of a deal would be a sign that the UK is kind of turning its back on those agreements, on its partners. But the idea is that no deal and that internal market bill would risk instability in Northern Ireland and at the border. Obviously, if they agree a deal, those clauses in the internal market bill are redundant. No need to worry. Whatever the deal is will cover how goods and the Northern Ireland Protocol will stand, and all will be well. And so the outcome, essentially, Joe Biden, his election, has created more pressure for there to be a deal, for none of these difficulties to arise, and the internal market bill to be relevant. And I hope that made sense and wasn't too kind of boring. As we come to the next slide, obviously there is rhetoric along with any trade negotiation, and so a lot of people put down these kind of comments and statements just to be nothing more than they are, and with both obviously the UK-EU negotiations going on and the possibility of, or the prospects of UK-US negotiations to come. Joe Biden's Irishness is quite interesting. He, like a lot of people in the US, calls himself Irish, despite the fact that it takes sort of 4 or 5 generations going backwards before you get to someone who did live in Ireland. But his great grandfather did emigrate to New York City from County Louth in Ireland in the 1840s, and so that's led him to say, in 2016, the quote was, "Being Irish without fear of contradiction has shaped my entire life." So I guess that's the role that nationality and that culture plays in his life. And yes, if we can come on to that last slide, obviously, you know, as Georgina referred to, a couple of aspects on both sides, and it's easy to kind of get overly, as journalists, like to kind of paint a narrative and lots of game changers, but ultimately it's very difficult to see the US and the UK being anything other than close allies. One thing the civil servant did say to me on the phone, who works around this area within the British government, he said that, you know, if the trade talks did fail to achieve a deal, even if Biden wasn't president and he had lost the election, the US would still have impacted on the UK's ability to get a trade deal with the US, because the Democrats would have, you know, been in charge of Congress, been in charge of the House at least, and they would have, you know, used that influence to put the UK to the back of the queue anyway. But anyway, yeah, it's obviously a question within the Democratic Party and within Joe Biden's office of which Boris Johnson they're getting. Are they getting the sort of liberal modern Boris that he likes to occasionally cosplay as, or the populist Trump friendly one? And I guess we'll find out.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. Of course, we've read that a big part of the aim of the musical chairs in Number 10 this past week has been to unleash the old friendly liberal London mayor version of Boris. We'll see if that comes about. That last slide, Eric, is it good or bad? Is Biden good or bad for a Brexit deal? Actually made me think that the question I really want to ask you is Biden good or bad for a comedian? Is he going to put you out of work for the next 4 years?
Well, I mean, I'm not an impressionist, but you know, everyone's had a Trump impression, but I've avoided doing one the last 4 years as a way to deny his legitimacy as my president. But but Biden is in particular, I mean, because he's what a Democrat brings to the table, which is what you want in many ways, is that he's boring. And, you know, I think many of us are hoping that we can actually sleep at night again and not worry about, you know, the enemy from within. So, yeah, I mean, he's less outrageous, but I'm sure there'll be plenty to satirize. And Trump doesn't look like he's going to go away. He sounds like he's going to announce he's running for 2024. So I have to update my MAGA hat and strap in for 4 more years, just with a gap that we'll never discuss.
Yeah. What's the gap? You mean?
Trump's going to take a little break.
Oh yeah, I see.
While he allows Biden to be president, he'll golf for a while, get as much money as he can out of his supporters, and then he'll come back in 2024. So
if that happened, it would be astonishingly similar to the pattern established by his mentor, Vladimir Putin. Of course,
yes. Yeah.
Out of power from 2008, 2012. Right. Look, as you know, because you've lived here for some time, we're slightly obsessed and very needy in this relationship that we call special.
Yeah.
Hence the predictable shallow headlines about the fact that Johnson turned out to be first in the pecking order among European leaders for a phone call from the president-elect. What do you think, if you can slide yourself into their shoes in Washington now, the team Biden, is any of that obsession with our relationship reciprocated, or are we just such small potatoes?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would imagine that the role is important, but I mean, I think more in the American imagination, Americans are quite fond of the UK. You know, culturally, you know, we absorb everything from 007 on down. See, you can hear my dog chipping in now, Giles. So maybe they're
Okay, I
trying
feel
to
better.
communicate with yours. But I think the U.S. as a sense, I mean, I think the monarchy is probably more popular in the U.S. than in the U.K. in many ways, ironically. But as far as the calculus in Washington, D.C., I mean, Georgina highlighted Biden speaking about the EU relationship and everything else. Oh, I'm getting visits from my masked wife. Hello. But she's not masked because of me, by the way. It's because my daughter's in self-quarantine because one of her classmates has come down with COVID. Yeah, where was I? Oh yeah, Biden talking about Brexit and the EU. I had missed that, and I've watched every debate and everything else as closely as one can.
Right.
It wasn't mentioned. I mean, maybe it was mentioned that one time, but I didn't see it brought up at any other debate or anywhere else. Americans are pretty self-obsessed. That's one of our strengths.
Right. I want to ask you as well, where were you and how did you react when the race was called?
I was coming back from a cycle ride with my son and following Twitter as much as you can cycle and look at Twitter at the same time, because I hadn't really slept since Tuesday happened. But it was more of a sense of exhaustion than excitement or elation. I mean, the people out on the streets in New York, I was watching, on the news, I just couldn't feel that because I'm just so worn down from this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so hard to see a president of the United States attacking the fundamentals of the democracy itself, that you just want it to be finished in many ways. What I did like were the fireworks that were going off that were left over from bonfire night, and the American media interpreting that as British enthusiasm for Biden's election. I don't think they realized that the fireworks happened 3 or 4 days before bonfire night and 3 or 4 days afterwards. And it's got nothing to do with Saturday when the race was finally called. But
right.
Yeah.
There is a point that has been mentioned in the chat by Nico McDonald, and you alluded to as well, saying that Trump is not going away. 70 million people still voted for Trump. In your view, knowing America as you do, what's the significance of that? Does that mean that actually a lot of the hopes and dreams now invested, and we'll come back to the specific focus of Brexit in a second, but invested in a Biden presidency will end up being not much more than liberal wishful thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it is, to me, that is the big question, because I know a lot of Democrats, they say we won, get on with it. And the people that voted for Trump were all racists. And I mean, don't get me wrong. I think, the racists were on the side of Team Trump, but there's a lot of people who look at Trump as an economic savior that I don't think he will ever be. But I think the needs of those people have to be addressed in many ways. I think the other problem that we have that's a problem here, which I think was fundamental in Brexit as well, and is a huge problem in the US, is the bubbles that we have worked ourselves into. Genuinely, when my liberal friends look at the Trump voter and say, how could they vote for this guy? Don't they see that he's scamming them? He's stealing from them. He's a thief. And I think he is inarguably all of those things, but they don't see that because they are in his Twitter feed, and they're in a maybe less so a Fox News bubble, more a OANN bubble, which is a very, very right-wing news network that's, Trump is directing people to, because they follow him even more now than Fox News, and another organization called Newsmax. They are in a completely different universe of reality and news. And until we can find a way to break through that, and, on the liberal side, it's there as well, but I think to a lesser extent, until we can get out of those individual bubbles, I don't know how the fundamentals of how a democracy works are in trouble. Mm. So the fact that those people voted for him, many of them don't even realize that, some of the things that I would say he's done that are wrong or criminal, because they're not even hearing about them.
Right.
So, you're living in different realities.
Right. A total information silo. Yes. And of course, their view is that we inhabit another information silo. Yeah.
I mean, there's if you follow those networks, and I do, you have election that's been stolen. You've got stolen ballots. You've got dead people voting. You've got dogs and cats voting. Everything is happening to steal this election, and trucks that have been driving away with ballots. And I think 86% of the Republican Party, based on a poll in the last day or so, think that this election has been stolen from Donald Trump.
Yeah. And in a second, I want to come to my colleague Chris Cook for a bit of Irish nitty gritty. But while we're talking, Eric, let me wrench you back to the question for today and Brexit. Do you think generally that even taking into account the last 4 years, the US presidency is a position whose occupant can not click fingers, but if he or she says the right words, can still make a difference in world affairs in the way that is the sort of premise of this conversation, that can change not the tone, but put down some red lines and thereby fundamentally change the direction of these Brexit talks?
Well, I still think, yeah, the U.S. does have a role. I mean, and I think we're going to see two things. One is that Biden is going to be consumed by the COVID crisis in the U.S., which Donald Trump is ignoring at the moment, even more than he did before. And also, the unrest that we've just talked about with those 72 million odd people that have supported Trump and live in another universe from thinking he's stolen the election. So that's going to be a huge domestic problems for the U.S. And then you start to add on racial problems and everything else. There's a lot going on back home in the States. But Biden is going to want to also turn, also because the vast amount of power in the presidency for foreign affairs, and re-engage with our NATO allies, stand up more firmly to Russia, all of those kind of things that we traditionally see in the Obama era. I would imagine that Obama foreign policy legacy is pretty much going to, I think, shift to Biden. I'm sure there's going to be some differences, but it's going to be a fairly similar team behind him as well, I would imagine, that he's reassembling some of the same old guard that will come through. And so I think we're going to hear an American voice give opinions, whereas, obviously Trump was kind of in the Brexiteer realm. That's obviously not going to be the case anymore. So my hope in many ways, because I wasn't a fan of Brexit, is that we're seeing the fever from 2016 burst, and we're seeing maybe a real alignment or a correction.
Well, I mean, that's a tremendously interesting general question about mood, isn't it? I mean, over here, we're somewhat constrained by the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, an 80-seat majority. The fundamentals of British politics feel a bit locked in for the foreseeable future. But it is a very interesting question as to whether the Biden election is indicative of a broader mood swing. But Chris, if you're there, you are. I want to come to you on these two specifics about Brexit and Biden and Ireland. When Biden says anything that endangers the Good Friday Agreement, is that sort of baked into Tory calculations, no surprises, or does it make a difference? And secondly, the point about sequencing trade deals. If you want, he has said explicitly, if you want one with us, you've got to get one with the EU first. Does that alter Tory calculations at this point?
So I don't think it does really. I think the central there's two or three things here, right? So the first is that the sequencing is that whatever decision we make in the short term on Brexit is going to be made before he even gets in the bid.
Yeah.
And so there's a limit to what he can do, obviously, in that interval, given that they're being very strict, in particular about there's only one president at a time sort of doctrine. So he'll be unwilling, I think, in the short term to. I don't even remember, there was a thing with Obama that there was an emergency G20 meeting after he'd been elected, but before he took office, and Obama refused to be in Washington when it was happening, or because he didn't want to make anyone doubt that Bush was still president. Right? He's Mr. sort of down the line. So I think the chance of him doing anything before January are basically zero. A thing to remember is that the Ireland takes its. I mean, Tom was slightly snippy about about Biden's Irishness, it's worth remembering literally in the 1916 Declaration, Ireland's exiled sons in America are one of the people to whom they literally say at that foundational moment that they, you know, that's one of their sources of support. Ireland's relationship with its diaspora is it will tease people for being plastic paddies, and it will crack jokes, particularly about their football team and its expansive view of Irishness, but it's something they invest an enormous amount of time in and an enormous amount of resource. And when those letters come out from you know, the congressional leaders in the US, those are things are drafted in Dublin, right? Like, we should be really clear. This is the consequence of a really sharp, pointy effort by the Irish government to use one of their sort of soft power tools, which is the Irish view of the diaspora, is that they are more Irish than we regard them. We find it faintly ridiculous because we basically regard British people who go to the US and become American, we consider them to be dissolved into Americanness in like 2 generations or 1 generation. We don't really, the idea of like a 3rd generation English person is bonkers to us. But that's basically because we think, fundamentally, we think wasps are us, right? That's what this is about. Anyway, I'm not a wasp, so I think you're all mad. But that's sort of, I think, the first sort of framing thing. I think you should though think of the importance of Biden's Irishness as being a non-trivial thing, for the simple reason that it gives the US a plausible lever over us that they did not have a few years ago, right? So can you imagine what will happen in London if he goes to sort of Ballina or Enniscrone or one of these like these sort of homeland towns before he comes to London? Can you imagine what it will do to the British press? Can you imagine the neuroses it will cause in Whitehall? And the fact that he can plausibly talk about Ireland in a way that makes it clear he's more interested in Ireland than he is in us is actually a weapon against us. I don't think that's helpful in terms of the trade deals or anything else, but what it will do is it'll give them a degree of moral suasion over us and political power over us that previous presidents have not had. I think on a trade deal, I think you just have to be, trade deals are both deeply political and strangely apolitical in lots of regards, right? They take such a long time to negotiate generally that they have to be done on a fairly bipartisan basis if they're going to be sort of done well. And that means that we kind of know what any trade deal looks like with the US, right? We kind of, like, the US trade reps publish their big list of asks. We know what it looks like. It doesn't change that much from administration to administration. You know, there are sort of tweaks and movements here and there, but actually we kind of know what they look like. And I think the fact they will have more power over us because of Biden's Irishness is significant, and potentially that could be a thing that if we start going more nuts in future years, that's a disciplining thing they can use against us. But, you know, I think that's sort of roughly where we are. I think so. William has asked, what about the defense, intelligence, NATO security, diplomatic relations we have with the US, right? This is a completely one-way bet, right? We have just chosen to basically hang out with the playground bully, and we could not, right? It's not clear to me that we put a lot into this relationship and they are not that keen. And I think we have to sort of accept that as a country. And it would be quite helpful if we got there faster. If having an Irish president gets us there, that would be actually a really good net positive thing for Britain. If we were to notice that we're 22 miles from one continent and several thousand from the other.
Chris, thank you. Thanks for raising that point, William. While we have you on the nitty gritty, actually, I came across an article today saying that we shouldn't say that anymore. But on the detail, is the neuralgia about the internal market bill a bit got up by Liberals, or is it legitimate? Or if I can put it the other way, do the Tories have a point when they say it is merely a backstop?
So you don't get to choose your own backstop. That's the point about the backstop. It was agreed by both sides.
Right.
The backstop was a thing that we negotiated with the EU. It was not a thing they did to us.
I shouldn't have used that word. I meant a contingency in the event of the last few weeks of negotiations not going well.
You're if they were really thinking about having a plan for if the negotiations go badly and we sort of crash out, you do it then, right? Insofar as if you're just going to break the treaty, then you can just do it. Like, you don't have to sort of telegraph down the line, we are willing to break the treaty. You know, this thing is coming in, sort of standing on a runway with, you know, your big lights, right? So that's why it still feels like signaling to me. Like, it's still an attempt to show that, you know, we're willing to do whatever it takes. It's an attempt to sort of grasp some leverage. Like, they basically, the idea is, if we have more asks, then the median point of the negotiation will come our way. And it's all quite naive. I mean, the fundamental thing about trade and macro stuff is that everyone knows each other's weaknesses and everyone knows each other's strengths. And we know what sort of works for each other. Like, we can see each other's press. There's no secrecy, you know, and you need legitimacy on both sides. So anyway, I think it's all nuts.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I want to go back, if we can, to the question Louise asked in the chat about Cummings, or maybe it wasn't a question, maybe it was your own point of view. In any case, I'd love to hear it. Louise Jarvis.
Hiya.
Hello.
Get the video on as well. Sorry. Yeah, no, it was just a genuine question. And I might have missed some of the discussion on it, but it was, you know, with everything that's going on, the chaos in number 10 at the moment, what, if any, impact does this have on the Brexit talks that are happening in parallel? You know, the fact that he's delayed, in inverted commas, his resignation to December, but the fact that the EU negotiators know he's going, and everything else they've heard about, that we've heard about, and maybe some other stuff as well. I'm just curious, what, if anything, do we think is the impact on the talks in that regard?
Thanks. Georgina, can I put that to you? What difference do this week's musical chairs make to the process?
I'm afraid to say, Louise, probably very little would be my answer. I think one of the things that the EU has been very keen to do throughout this whole process is not basically intervene in any way in like British domestic politics. And you saw that during Article 50, where there were very few comments on what was going on in Parliament and the drama there. And very much you would expect the same now, where they're not going to comment on that. And I don't think that changes their calculation. They're negotiating with the UK government. The UK government has a mandate of what it wants out of this trade deal. And, you know, and Michel Barnier's team know the British negotiators, and they're now at the point where they're talking about detail. Whether Dominic Cummings is in or out of number 10 is frankly irrelevant, because as far as I'm aware, he was never in that room negotiating. So, you know, if his departure fundamentally changed the UK's mandate for negotiate, possibly, but given he's only leaving in December, I'm not sure that's going to change anything. So no.
I'm interested that you say that. It just shows how far I am from number 10, but I find it hard to believe that well, I suppose they're not actually physically leaving until the end of the year, but the fact that they're on their way out, two key aides who are also vote leave veterans, to be replaced, and of course I'm just sort of recycling all the commentary of the last 24 hours, to be replaced by Remainer-ish faces. James Slack worked for May, who was a Remainer. Allegra Stratton, I don't know her personal politics, but she's a sort of a sensible, a centrist, a moderate. If at any point, I mean, if we park the mandate, if between now and the 31st there's a go no go decision to be made by the chief executive Boris Johnson, does not the way that the people around him lean make a difference to that decision?
Possibly, but ultimately that call is Boris Johnson's call. It's not anyone else's call. And I think that's how the EU treats. I mean, the EU have approached this negotiation in the same way they approach all their trade negotiations. So they, you know, appoint a very good team. They work out what the other side's positions are going to be, and they try and identify zones of compromise. And they also have a mandate that the Commission has discussed relentlessly with member states to know how much they can move as well. And in a sense, it's not, and you feel this very much when you talk to people across, so in the EU, they say, our role is not to really try and understand, internal party politics or the Conservative Party's position on Brexit, or what the advisors around the Prime Minister think. We are negotiating with the UK government. We have a mandate, unless the UK government, and so the Prime Minister then signs off and says, oh yes, I'm going to have a fundamental reshift, and yes, let's opt for a softer Brexit. That might change the gap, but we're so late in the day. I would imagine that if we are going to see a deal, they're pretty much close to it now, and they're going to be looking in the technical details. And I just don't think that this is something, they're not going to now start thinking about multiple scenarios. They will only do that if the Prime Minister decides that that's what he wants to do.
Right. So just to be clear, about you're saying that the conversations now in the tunnel will be about details, but given the shortness of time as the enemy, as you described it, I'm hoping that even at that level, most of the key questions have already been decided. I
mean, yeah, and actually both sides have gone on record saying that they've made a lot of progress over the past couple of weeks, that actually there's been movement also on sort of, issues like security cooperation or police and judicial cooperation. All of that has made significant progress, and that's a good sign. But, that even if you've agreed 80%, you still need to agree the other 20%. And at the end of the day, we know that the big stumbling blocks are the most tricky issues, not necessarily from a legal and technical perspective, but from a political perspective. Because on fisheries, both sides stand to lose. There's no way that both sides can gain. So it's a very difficult sell domestically. And on issues around, subsidies and governance, so how you manage divergence between the UK and the EU going forward, how you resolve disputes, those are also quite political decisions, because it's for the UK government, it's a position of, well, how much of a structure do we want with the EU? We're leaving the EU, we want to go, we want to embrace our freedom, we don't want this architecture with the EU, but equally we'll need some form of architecture, because otherwise we might have a much more limited access to the world's biggest market than we would like. So it is political, I think, but once you've unblocked that, I think the legal and technicalities, negotiators can move quickly, and they know each other well. So
thank you. I'm just looking at the Albie Cohen writes in the chat, didn't James Slack run the Daily Mail Enemies of the People headline? Hard to classify that as Remainerish. I think I know who actually wrote that headline, and it wasn't James Slack. But I carry no water for him. I actually know nothing. He may have written a story underneath it, but just on a point of detail, I don't think it was him who wrote the headline. And above that, Louise Simpson, because it's a question that is kind of prompted by the global mood music change over the last. Can we come to you, Louise? I'd love you to put that question, even if it's a sort of a Hail Mary.
Yeah, it is a Hail Mary, but I mean, he's done so many U-turns. Perhaps his last one, and let's hope it is his last one, will be just to say, this is just a nightmare. Let's just not do it.
Okay, I want to, amazingly, we're running out of time already. I want to put that to Georgina and Chris and Eric. I mean, as Martin says in the chat just below that, Brexit has happened, and presumably there will be a transition from the transitional period to the next phase of whatever we're going to live through on December 31st. But given that there's a prospect of horrendous truck queues, a very big economic hit, Kent as for some reason, a giant Portaloo has taken over from the truck park image. Won't there be a temptation when we get right down to it to settle for something that looks really as close as possible to the status quo, even though we are now all resigned to the idea that we're going to call it Brexit? Eric, what do you think?
I mean, I think the chance of them reversing the course that we're on right now at this point is impossible. As much as I would love to see that happen. I mean, when Trump was elected post-Brexit, I know some people were saying, "Oh, this is America's Brexit" and so on. And as we're seeing, because Trump is being voted out of office unless the Republicans manage to steal it, which is essentially what they're trying to do. But anyway. That the system happening. He won the Electoral College, he became president, he's losing the popular vote and the Electoral College this time, he will not be president. Brexit was a fundamental shakeup of the constitutional structure or the relationship treaty-wise of the UK. So it was a much bigger revolution in a lot of ways. So unfortunately, especially after the elections that we've had and the mandate allegedly that we have for Brexit, it has to happen. Or I know that Brexit has happened, but I mean the change, the reality of it after January 1st has to happen before anybody can say that the will be there to bring us back. And unfortunately, we have to go through whatever happens on the 1st of January, which I think is even more dangerous now post-COVID because the country's weaker financially than it was even before. But there's no way to reverse that until we swallow the bitter pill.
Chris, I know that if I phrase this in concrete terms, then you will knock it down with a Thor's hammer. But so let me rephrase it in very woolly terms. Did we just pass peak populism?
No, I don't think so. I mean, like, it's worth going back a step to so first of all, it's one election in one country, right? I mean, but also like Biden's shtick is not exactly like a sort of part of his shtick is being like an everyman. Like he is it's been sort of lost to memory, but The Onion used to do a whole thing about how Joe Biden was like The Onion, the satirical newspaper, their running joke about Joe Biden when he was in the White House was that he was continuously cleaning his car, his Trans Am, on the drive of the White House topless. That was his the joke was he was sort of ludicrously everymanish everyman. And it's possible to go to overread into this stuff. So I think that's not true. I think you also have to remember is that one of the most successful populist parties in the world at the moment is the SNP. Like, what else are they if not populists? They are, they ran in 2014 on the idea that you had to save the NHS, you had to leave the nation to which the N in NHS refers, right? Their willingness to, if we, depending on how we define populism, their willingness to say what it takes to meet their nationalist objective is pretty remarkable. But, yeah.
I take your point about the SNP. Matteo Salvini's finding he's got a bit less traction in Italy than he used to have. Merkel's seen off the AfD for now.
I think there's a mistake though to bracket all these people together to begin with. I think that's
okay.
So I think the lines between even like Brexit and Trump are not that clear. I think they are one of the stronger links because I think it was the Brexit coalition in the UK was actually surprisingly similar to the Republicans coalition. And when you look at the demography, it maps more clearly onto that than the Republican coalition maps more clearly onto the Brexit coalition than say the Conservative Party's votership to the Republican votership. But I think you have to be really careful drawing further lines out into Italian politics. And
thank you. Georgina, I will come back to you in a second, but I'm intrigued by Sonia Zanagi's iceberg analogy. Sonia, can we come to you? That I tried to start this hour with a bit of optimism. That sounds a bit miserable. Tell us what you think is going to happen on December 31st.
I think it's going to be a massive shock. There's no way. I don't see how the UK can reach really a deal, even like a bad deal. I think the no deal is very much on the table. Is the only option left, and I don't know. I am pessimistic. obviously I am from Europe, so I don't see it from a good way. And but I think we are for a big shock. And I think, as Eric mentioned, I think the UK will have to swallow the bitter pill before maybe hoping to backtrack or find ways to come out of this situation, really.
I'm really interested that you think that. Is there anything in particular that you have seen that makes you think, no, this is not like previous European negotiations. This is not simply brinkmanship?
I mean, I just find, I mean, in what I read and the discussion you hear in the media, obviously a lot is hanging up on fisheries, and a lot is talking about, you know, the logistics of commerce. But the biggest commerce of the UK is services, and it's, I don't think much is being talked about, unless I'm missing, you know, the topic. But what happens, you know, anything with, you know, data transfers, any form of service providing, financial services, it's just nowhere near the you know, general conversation for the time being. But I may be wrong.
Okay, well, let's ask Georgina about that. I wanted to finish up actually, Georgina, with your assessment, just your gut take on what is going to happen, the way Brexit is going to pan out. You've been pretty clear, I think, that you've painted a picture of the processes actually on a set of rails, not completely rigid, but certainly some momentum in a particular direction. And I'd love to know what direction you think ultimately that is. But just to pick up on Sonia's point, services account for 80% of the UK economy. Is it the case that unless a deal is agreed, there will be no template for the UK service sector to operate in Europe after December 31st?
So I mean, you know, there are a couple of things here, aren't there? First is, obviously services are notoriously difficult to include in any free trade agreement. I mean, the best way to ensure that you can export your services is being in the same market, which is why so many people in the EU were surprised when they saw the Brexit referendum outcome, because they thought, oh my goodness, you know, the UK is a services driven economy. Who is it going to trade its services with? Because they are so difficult to include. The second, I think, point to remember is, you know, the UK has left now. The only reason why we can't see any difference is because it's still part of the EU market. On the 1st of January, that looks radically different. And third, the UK has opted for a harder form of Brexit. It didn't have to. It could have chosen to remain in the single market. It could have chosen to have some to remain in the EU's customs union. And so practically speaking, that would mean reduced paperwork, perhaps not the need for health checks at the border and all sorts of things. But the government didn't want that. The government wanted to make the most of its sovereignty, its newly found freedom, and have the ability to diverge. Well, the EU then has reacted and said, fine, if you want that, we will treat you like we treat every other third country. So we will impose checks on your goods coming into our borders. We will make sure that you have, you know, signed up to the right databases, that you filled in the right paperwork. And that's not just UK traders sort of GB traders exporting to the EU. It's also very much, you know, transports and haulers and all of that kind of stuff. But in a sense, this isn't the EU being difficult. This is just the processes that the EU uses for any third countries. And that's the final point is, I think on the EU side, if you talk to governments, they feel like their border is as ready as it could be. They have their customs officials in place. They have the databases up and running. They have all the border infrastructure they need because they're used to it. The scale of the task is a lot bigger here in the UK. And as I said at the beginning, the government has tried to buy itself time. For the first 6 months, it will waiver most of the requirements on EU goods coming into Great Britain. But at some point, it's going to have to do something. And, you know, and that is going to be very cumbersome. And finally, you know, coming back to your point, Giles, about could the EU and the UK find a way to transition out of the current, sort of phase out the current relationship and phase in the new one? I mean, I just don't think so. If you wanted to do that, you should have started negotiating it months ago, because legally it requires for the EU to find a treaty base in its treaty. That's very complicated. Some member states might even have to put in past legislation. It's all very late in the day to do that. And finally, I think both sides are a bit tired of all of this. And so, yes, Brexit is the gift that keeps on giving. Of course, they will need to continue talking. If there are changes in legislation on both sides, that might require reopening some discussions on market access, but they don't really want a prolonged another 4 years of Brexit discussions of phasing out and phasing in and new deadlines. It's just, that's not what anyone wants at this point in time. Not even me.
Which suggests to me that to an extent you're agreeing with what Sonia was saying. One way or another, that there is going to be a fairly abrupt transition on December 31st.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because once you leave a market, you're no longer one market. There are requirements to be able to export to new markets, and that's just the way it is. But that's been known for a while, and the government has, lots of things up on its website about how this will change. It's just, I think it will. I'm not sure that businesses, particularly small businesses that don't have the bandwidth and capacity to think about this because of COVID, and particularly citizens, know exactly what that change will look like. And of course, remember, if there is a deal, there might be less paperwork required. There might be some ways of kind of minimizing checks, but all of that hinges on what comes out of these discussions. And we won't know that until we see the actual deal on the table.
Thank you so much. Eric, one last thing for you. Are you looking forward to making any comedy out of truck parks in Kent or the whole fisheries question, which accounts for less than 1% of our economy? And anyway, we don't like the fish that we have in our...
The fish humor is just ripe with comic potential. No, I'm looking forward to spending more time in Kent because I won't be able to gig in Europe anymore because I'm on a British passport and an American passport, and I don't think I'll be able to get a visa for popping over for a gig. So when it comes to the services economy that Sonia was talking about earlier, yeah, I mean, that's the thing that none of us know that are used to be able to pop over and do a gig or that kind of thing. Who knows? Who knows what's going to happen? It's exciting, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you know what? An hour ago, I was quite excited. I was sunny, and I scribbled at the top of my piece of paper, as I said, will Biden make a difference? Will he get us a deal? Coming back to that, thanks a lot, guys. The answers seem to be no and no. Although, as Chris reminded us, Biden's Irishness is non-trivial. Georgina, however, pointed out that in her view, assessments of his potential impact on the Brexit process may have probably been exaggerated, and that the musical chairs in the past week in Downing Street will probably not make much difference. I might continue to cling to a view that Britain is not immune from global changes of mood, and I think for all of us anyway, the next 6 weeks ticking down will be anxious ones. So at least we have another reason to bite our fingernails, even though the American election process is largely over now. Although Eric made the point that 70 million Trump supporters continue to inhabit one news and information silo, and 77 million another. I think there are reasons to be cheerful. One of them certainly is that you all took the trouble to join us for Sensemaker Live today. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Georgina. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Sonia. Those just happen to be the people who are at the top of my screen. And Mark for inviting everybody, and Ella for doing the chat. Have a great weekend and see you next week. Bye-bye.